captives wore many faces, yet
I can't do this just yet.
What's up guys, Moby here with a new build, and this time it is melee Cyclone, Ngamahu's Flame with Expedition's End and Heat Shiver, and also with Herald of Ice. These are the core pieces of this build. With this build we convert 100% of physical damage to elemental damage. Ngamahu's Flame converts 60% of physical damage to fire damage, and the remaining 40% of physical damage will be converted to cold damage by this Cold Mastery. The core idea of this build is that Cyclone, and especially melee, is very fun but also very dangerous in Path of Exile nowadays. This is why we want to freeze enemies in order to not be in danger all of the time. This is also why we use Expedition's End. Expedition's End makes all damage being able to freeze, and also freeze chilled enemies as though dealing 79% more damage. In this case it can also go up to 100% more damage. So with this chest we can freeze through fire damage as well as cold damage. On top of that we're using the new reworked Heat Shiver helmet, which makes us gain 1% of cold damage as extra fire per 1% chill effect. And nearby enemies are always chilled due to the Expedition's End and also due to the cold damage that we inflict, especially with the Molten Burst that we trigger on the melee hit with Cyclone. And also we gain 100% of cold damage as extra fire against frozen enemies. During map clear, also in T16 maps, as you could have seen during the Hydra map, almost every monster, also the rare Arch-Nemesis monsters or Harvest monsters, will be frozen by us very reliably. It gets a bit tricky on the endgame bosses, like also T16 bosses are not an issue. They can be frozen as well, and they are getting frozen kind of reliably also. But the Guardians, like Hydra, you could have seen that her action speed cannot be 0. So she cannot obviously not be frozen, but technically she can still be frozen even though her action speed is not reduced to 0. So the extra damage can also work on Guardians like Hydra, even though you don't see it, because her action speed is still not 0 and she's still moving. Let's have a closer look at the gear. Ngamahu's Flame, it shows a corrupt with increased area of effect. That is very important for the Cyclone to feel good. If you can afford it, then you also should look for the increased attack speed. Then the Expedition's End and the Heat Shiver, we've talked about these already. I have Herald of Ice has 75% increased mana reservation efficiency, so that I can make use of Herald of Ice, then Hatred, Herald of Purity and Precision, without grabbing any of the increased reservation efficiency nodes. So then we choose the Yoke of Suffering, which makes our elemental damage being able to shock. So since we're mainly dealing fire and cold damage, this damage cannot shock. But with the Yoke of Suffering, we can also shock with fire and cold damage, which is very useful. And also enemies take 5% increased damage for each type of ailment you have inflicted on them, and we inflict many different ailments. The taming is also very good because it gives increased damage with hits and ailments per freeze, shock, or ignite on them. And of course, a rare ring, a rare endgame ring could be better than this one, but it's hard to beat. Then we have here some life, accuracy, 18 life per enemy hit with attacks. That is very nice, very important, because we hit a lot with the molten balls. And then we have some life and resistances. And brittle ground. Brittle ground is very important in order to increase the critical strike chance. And also, brittle ground is also an ailment, which makes the enemy take another 5% increased damage. The belt, also some life and resistances and increased elemental damage with attacks if you can afford it. And last but not least, we have the Malagaros Virtuosity. These are very underused and underrated gloves, which makes the critical strike multiplier to be 300. So that means if you have no investment in critical strike multiplier, the critical strike multiplier would be 150, like this, 150%. So this one alone gives you 150 critical strike multiplier on top of the critical strike chance, the attack speed, some dexterity, some evasion. And since they are so cheap and underused, you can also have a decent corrupt on them, in this case elemental weakness. For flasks, we have a life flask, of course. Then we have Dying Sun, that is very important because of the area of effect, and also the 2 additional projectiles for the Molten Burst. Then we have a Quicksilver flask. And Taste of Hate is also very good flask. And this one is kind of optional at Serious Promise. You could also use some critical strike chance flask or something else. Gems next. Cyclone is linked to Trinity. Trinity is very important because we deal fire and cold damage, so we can make use of that one. Then melee physical damage support, infused channeling, inspiration, and in this case I took Awakened, added cold damage, but you can also take something else. Molten Burst gets supported by Hypothermia, which is also very useful. Inspiration, elemental damage with attacks, greater multiple projectiles and Witch's projectiles, and also the Trinity, of course. Then we have Ancestral Warchief, Ancestral Protector for the boss fights, and also Anomalous Blood Rage. That's what I use in order to generate Frenzy Charge when you hit a unique enemy. This is kind of expensive, but you don't need it. You really don't need it. You can have a budget version of this build for, like, I don't know, maybe 2 divines or 1 divine, and that one could work also in red maps. Dash, Precision. Life tab is linked to customer damage taken and Immortal Call. We have Goliath Anointed so that we can gain endurance charges when we stun an enemy, and the endurance charges can then be removed by the customer damage taken and the Immortal Call. And then we have the auras Hatred, Herald of Ice, Herald of Purity, and it is linked to Enlighten in order that we can use all 4 of them. Tree, so we are Slayer. So first lap I took Brutal Fervor for the Overleech. This is basically the only defensive layer that we have apart from freezing enemies. Then Impact, this is very important in order to get area of effect, also accuracy, and also some melee damage. Even though the melee damage isn't that fantastic because the Molten Burst, which is the main source of damage on this build, that comes from the Ngamahu's Flame. You can look at it, it's here, you know. This is the main damage source, and this is not counted as melee. It is just an attack. It's an attack and projectile attack, but not a melee attack, so the deal up to 15% more melee damage only applies to the Cyclone. Then, of course, we go with Bane of Legends and Headsman, and since the critical strike chance of Ngamahu's Flame is very low, it's only 5%, I also took Overwhelm, so that the base crit is at 8%. This is also not optimal because we do not profit from the 10% to critical strike multiplier per nearby enemy up to 100%, since the crit multi is always 300. Yeah. Because of these gloves. You could also go with the Masterful Form, which makes sense, absolutely. Maybe I should do that as well in order to get more endurance charges, but that's up to you. So let's have a look at the rest of the tree. We grab attack speed here, then we grab the life nodes that are on the way, then we go with increased physical damage with two-handed melee weapons. Keep in mind that, as I said, you do not want to have nodes that only provide melee damage, because only the Cyclone profits from melee damage, not the main damage source, the Molten Burst, which is not a melee skill, it is just an attack. Okay, keep that in mind. This is why we grab these nodes, increase damage with attacks while focused, that's okay. Melee hits fortify, so that we gain a bit of defenses. Frenzy. Here, this one is very good. It gains Onslaught for 4 seconds on kill. That's very important. Yeah, Onslaught for 4 seconds on kill, and also the attacks with Axis grant 1 rage on hit. That's very good. Then we go with Wild Pact for the Slayer, of course, point blank in order to increase the damage of the balls. Up here, we want to go this way, and the chance to freeze. Since our critical strike chance is not that high, we want to have this one rather than that one. Ideally, if our critical strike chance would be higher, we would want the right route here for the increased effect of non-damaging elements. Here we get the gain 10% of physical as extra of a random element. Here we gain both of these because here we gain 10% of Fizz as extra cold. That's good. And we also take these two ones because of the increased effect of cold elements. Yeah. Then, yeah, this way, here I have the Forbidden Flesh for the Overwhelm, which is like 30 chaos, 40 chaos. That's like nothing. Wind Dancer is kind of useful here because we don't get hit very often, so maybe we could experiment with it or take it out. I'm not very sure, but I believe that it is rather good. Also, then we have here 10% increased movement speed if you haven't taken damage recently. Penetration. This node is very good. I like this a lot because it solves all of the mana problems that you might have. And here I took a Brutal Restraint. It has 5% of Fizz as extra cold. Alchemist Genius, okay. Cold Resistance, 5% of Fizz is extra cold. Again. And some Dex. Overall, this is a very good farming build. It's very nice, very fun. It reminds us of the good old times, you know, back when melee was still kind of good. Now, melee has a hard time. It's in a tough spot right now. And especially with the endgame bosses, you don't want to do this build with endgame bosses probably. But yeah, it's still a very fun build. And if you have any suggestions to this build, if you have done something similar, or if you think that you should do something completely differently, then just put it in the comments. I will read it, I will answer. And yeah, thank you very much for watching. See you next time.